The storm had been raging for hours. The dark clouds twisted and churned in the vast sky, a deadly reminder of the dangerous forces at work in space. Across the galaxy, ships had been caught in the violent storm, some breaking apart while others struggled to survive. Among the ships in peril was one from the Scifi, a race known for their advanced technology and unmatched intellect. Inside the Scifi craft, Vera, the young princess of the Scifi people, lay in her chamber, unaware of the chaos outside. The princess had been through so much already. Her legs were badly injured in an accident during a previous mission, and now she was unable to walk without the help of a mobility device. Her body had once been a symbol of strength and grace, but now it was fragile, broken. Vera's eyes flickered open as she felt a sudden jolt. The ship shook violently as the storm outside slammed into it again. The alarms blared, warning of a critical failure. The ship had been struck by a stray bolt of lightning from the storm, causing a chain reaction that was sending the craft plummeting toward an unknown planet. The ship's automated systems tried to stabilize the descent, but it was no use. Vera's heart raced in her chest as she struggled to make her way to the emergency escape pod. The Scifi technology was meant to save lives, but with her mobility device malfunctioning, Vera found herself unable to move quickly. The storm outside grew fiercer, and the shaking only worsened. With a final desperate effort, Vera managed to reach the escape pod. She climbed inside, hoping for a miracle. The pod shot out of the failing ship, hurtling through the atmosphere toward the surface of a nearby planet. It was the only chance she had left. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the pod, everything was silent. The pods were built for safety, designed to protect the passengers from the dangers of space travel. However, as the pod descended toward the desert planet below, Vera couldn't help but feel a sense of hopelessness. She had been abandoned, stranded in an unfamiliar world, alone and helpless. After what seemed like an eternity, the escape pod crashed into the sand. The impact was harsh, but the pod's protective layers had absorbed most of the shock. Vera's breath came in short gasps as she lay still, the world around her spinning. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to stay conscious. She could hear the faint whir of the pod's damaged systems, trying to send a distress signal, but the world around her was quiet. Vera's once shining eyes, now clouded with fear, looked out of the small window of the pod. The landscape outside was vast and barren, nothing but endless dunes of sand stretching as far as the eye could see. She didn't know where she was, but she knew she couldn't stay there. The storm had torn apart her home, and now it had left her stranded on an unknown desert planet. Her people, her family, they were all gone. The last of her kind, stranded in an endless desert, with no hope in sight. She tried to move, but her legs were too weak. Her mobility device, which had been damaged during the crash, was useless now. She had no way to get out of the pod, no way to search for help. The heat outside was unbearable, and Vera could feel the dry desert air seeping into the pod, making it harder to breathe. She closed her eyes, wishing for the strength to survive, to keep going, but her body was not cooperating. She had been through so much already, and now all she wanted was to rest. The pain from her injuries, combined with the loneliness of her situation, was too much to bear. But just as she was about to give in, she heard something. It was faint at first, but slowly the sound grew louder, a noise like footsteps. Someone, or something, was out there. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be another survivor? Could someone have come to rescue her? With a final burst of strength, Vera tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. Her mind raced with thoughts of hope and fear, and then, as the world around her faded once more, she lost consciousness. The sun was beginning to set over the endless desert, casting long shadows across the sand. The air was dry, heavy with the heat of the day, but the desert was quiet now, almost peaceful. For hours, there had been no sign of movement, just the endless stretch of golden dunes. The world seemed empty, abandoned, much like the young alien girl trapped in the escape pod. David Forsyth had been exploring the desert for days. He had come to the planet on a mission to search for the lost ruins of an old human colony. As a former military officer turned adventurer, David was used to traveling alone, relying on his skills to survive the harshest environments. The desert was no stranger to him. He knew its dangers well: the scorching sun during the day, the freezing cold at night, and the creatures that roamed beneath the surface, waiting for the unwary. David had been walking for hours when he noticed something strange. His communicator buzzed with a faint signal, one that didn't belong in the desert. It was weak, almost lost in the background noise of the environment, but it was there. He checked the coordinates and realized that the signal was coming from somewhere nearby. Curiosity tugged at him. What could it be? A hidden base, a broken transmitter from the old colony, or something else entirely? With quick, sure steps, he headed toward the source of the signal. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. David's eyes scanned the landscape, his military instincts alert for anything unusual. It wasn't long before he spotted a small metal object half buried in the sand. It looked like an escape pod, strange yet familiar. David knelt beside it and brushed the sand away, revealing the pod's exterior. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The markings on the surface were not of any human origin. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that this was no ordinary piece of wreckage. The pod had clearly crashed, but it seemed intact. The door was sealed, but there was a faint glow from inside. He quickly retrieved his tools and began to work on the pod's hatch. The pod seemed to be in an advanced state of disrepair, but David's skills were enough to open it. The door creaked as it slid open, and a rush of stale air escaped from within. Inside, lying motionless, was the alien girl. David's breath caught in his throat as he looked at her. Her skin was pale, almost silver, and her long hair shimmered with a strange iridescent glow. She wore a suit of technology that was far more advanced than anything he had ever seen before. But what struck him the most was the expression on her face. It wasn't one of fear or aggression. It was one of exhaustion, pain, and something else: vulnerability. He didn't hesitate. David carefully reached inside the pod and gently lifted the girl in his arms. She was light, fragile, and seemed completely lifeless. He quickly checked her vitals, but she was still breathing, faintly. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts from the crash, and her mobility device, once an elegant piece of advanced technology, was now nothing more than a broken shell. It was clear she wouldn't be able to walk without help, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. David's mind raced as he considered his options. The desert was no place for someone in her condition. He had to get her out of there, back to safety, and find help. But who else was out here? The thought of navigating the dangerous landscape alone with an unconscious alien girl made his stomach twist, but he didn't have time to hesitate. The situation was urgent. With one last glance at the pod, David turned and began to walk back toward his camp, carrying the girl in his arms. The desert was vast, and it would take hours to reach his shelter, but he moved with purpose. The temperature was dropping, and the air was beginning to grow colder, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, one step at a time. As the hours passed, the night grew darker, and the stars began to appear in the sky. The only sound was the soft crunch of sand beneath his boots and the quiet breathing of the girl in his arms. David's thoughts drifted to what he had discovered: an alien girl, alone in the desert, with no explanation as to how she had ended up there. Who was she? Where had she come from? And more importantly, who would come looking for her? Despite the weight of his questions, David pushed them aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on them now. All that mattered was getting her back to his camp, getting her the help she needed. The night would be long, and the journey difficult, but David Forsyth was determined. He would do whatever it took to protect her. The desert night was cold, the air crisp and dry. David finally reached his camp, the small shelter he had set up after days of wandering the endless sand dunes. The light of his campfire flickered in the distance, a welcome sight after the long, tiring journey. His arms ached from carrying the alien girl, but he didn't stop. She had to be his priority now. He carefully laid her down on the makeshift bed inside his tent, the soft fabric of his survival blanket providing some comfort. The warmth from the campfire bathed the small space in a soft glow. David moved quickly, his hands working with practiced efficiency. He was no stranger to emergencies, and this one was no different. He had to act fast if he was going to save her. David set to work examining her injuries. Her face, once beautiful and serene, was bruised, and small cuts dotted her skin. Her body trembled, though her breathing remained steady. He checked her legs, which were obviously in worse shape. The mobility device she had been using was damaged beyond repair, and her legs appeared stiff, unable to move. It was clear that her condition was serious, but it wasn't too late to help her. David reached into his pack and pulled out his medical supplies. He had basic first aid equipment, enough to deal with minor injuries, but this was different. He wasn't sure what kind of medical care she would need, but he had to try. His hands moved gently as he cleaned the wounds on her face and arms. He could feel the weight of her stillness, the quiet pain she was hiding. There was something about her, something fragile and vulnerable, that made him more determined to help. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but the look on her face told him one thing: she needed him. The work was slow, but David didn't mind. He applied bandages to her wounds, checking her temperature and her breathing every few minutes. The girl had been through something terrible, and he had to make sure she stayed stable. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she came from. Her features were unlike anything he had seen before. She was alien, yes, but there was a grace to her, something ethereal in her appearance that made her stand out even more in this harsh, barren desert. David's thoughts were interrupted as the girl's eyes fluttered open. Slowly, she blinked, her silver blue eyes meeting his. She looked confused, disoriented, and for a moment, she stared at him in silence, her gaze distant. David said softly, hoping to ease her fear. "You're safe now." The girl's lips parted, but no sound came. She tried to sit up, but pain flashed across her face, and she gasped, holding her legs. David immediately moved to stop her, gently placing his hands on her shoulders to keep her from straining herself. "Easy," he urged, his voice calm but firm. "You need to rest." Her eyes fixed on him, and she seemed to understand. She nodded slightly, though she still looked confused and unsure. David's heart softened as he looked at her. She wasn't just an alien. She was a person, someone who had been through something unimaginable. "I'm David," he said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm here to help you." She tried to speak, but only a faint, raspy sound escaped her lips. Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. David could tell it was going to take time for her to regain her strength. "I'm going to help you," he repeated, his voice firm with resolve. "You're not alone anymore." The girl's eyes studied him for a moment, searching his face, as though trying to understand whether she could trust him. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice soft and strained. "Vera," she whispered, her words broken but clear. "Vera is my name." David nodded. "Vera," he repeated quietly. "You're safe, Vera." As the night stretched on, David continued to care for Vera, checking her injuries and offering her water when she could drink. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and the tremors in her body seemed to ease. Though she was still weak, there was a faint spark of life returning to her eyes. David's mind raced as he worked. Who was she? What was she doing on this planet? And why was she all alone in the desert? But for now, there was only one thing he could do: help her heal. The answers could wait. Right now, Vera needed him, and he wasn't going to let her down. As the hours passed, the desert night grew quieter, and the warmth of the campfire began to seep into their bones. David stayed by Vera's side, watching over her as she slept. There was still so much to learn about her, but for now, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of duty. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He had promised himself that. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, David made a silent vow. He would keep Vera safe, and he would find out who was responsible for leaving her stranded on this desolate world. As the days passed, Vera grew stronger. The injuries on her body healed slowly, but there was a spark in her eyes that David hadn't seen before. She was beginning to trust him, to believe that she might be safe here, even on this strange desert world. David had set up a small shelter beside the campfire, a place where they could rest and stay protected from the desert's harsh winds. He had found a few supplies in the wreckage of her escape pod. Tools, a strange device that seemed to be some sort of communication tool, and a small personal item that Vera clutched close to her chest whenever she slept. It was clear that this girl, this alien, had once been part of something much larger, something important. One evening, as the sun set and the sky filled with colors of deep orange and purple, David sat by the fire, sharpening a knife. Vera was sitting a little further away, her back straight, and her gaze focused on the horizon. It was the first time since the crash that she had seemed somewhat at peace. She no longer looked terrified or lost. She looked thoughtful. David watched her for a moment before speaking. "How do you feel today?" Vera's eyes shifted to him, and she nodded slightly. "Better," she replied, her voice still soft but clearer than before. "Thank you." David smiled, but his smile quickly faded as the thought of what lay ahead crossed his mind. "I know you've been through a lot, but we need to talk. You can't stay here forever. The desert isn't safe, and I'm not sure how long this place will be untouched by others. Someone might come looking for you." Vera's face grew serious as she slowly turned toward him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as though she was processing his words. It was clear she hadn't considered that possibility before. "I know," she said softly, after a long pause. "I can't stay here, but I don't know where else to go." David leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I think I can help you. I know this planet better than anyone, and I can get us to safety. But it's going to be dangerous. I'll need your help too." At the mention of needing her help, Vera's face brightened slightly. She seemed to understand what he was asking. "Help," she repeated, her voice curious. David nodded. "You might not be able to walk, but I've seen the way you move. You've got strength in you, and I think you can still fight. We might be able to reach the ruins of an old Zathari temple I've heard about. There's something there that might help us." The mention of her people, her lost people, made Vera's expression change. A shadow passed over her face, but she didn't look away. Instead, she seemed to hold her emotions in check. She had lost so much. Her home, her family, everything was gone. But David's words gave her a reason to move forward. "I know the place you speak of," she said quietly. "I've heard of it, from the stories." David raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You have? You're sure?" Vera nodded slowly. "I think it might be the key to everything." David was silent for a moment, trying to process what she had said. The idea of heading into a ruined temple in the middle of a dangerous desert wasn't exactly what he had in mind, but something about Vera's calmness made him think it was worth the risk. Maybe it was fate. Maybe she was right. "You really think there's something there?" he asked, though he was already starting to prepare himself mentally for the journey. "I do," she said, her voice more confident now. "I can guide us, but we need to be careful. There are dangers on this planet. It's not just the desert. We can't be too careful." David nodded, his mind already racing through the plans they would need to make. There were many unknowns: Vera's condition, the dangers they would face in the desert, and whatever waited in the ruins. But he didn't hesitate. He would protect her. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. "We'll be careful," he said firmly. "But first, we'll need to make sure you're in good condition to travel. We'll gather supplies and make a plan. We'll leave as soon as you're ready." Vera met his gaze and gave a small nod. "I will be ready. Soon." David smiled again, a bit more confident now. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but with Vera's help, they stood a chance. He had no idea what they might find in the ruins or what dangers lay ahead. But one thing was certain, he would not face them alone. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. They would reach the temple, and they would survive. The next morning, the desert was quieter than it had been in days. The sun had risen early, casting a pale light over the endless sand. David and Vera were ready to leave. Supplies had been packed, and the last of their preparations were done. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but there was no turning back now. David could tell that Vera was still weak, but she was determined. Her eyes had the same focused look they'd had the night before when she talked about the ruins. She wasn't the same broken person who had crash-landed in the desert days ago. She had a purpose now, a reason to keep going. They started walking, Vera moving slowly but steadily by David's side. He kept an eye on her, ready to help if she needed it, but she was proud, and she refused to let him carry her. She insisted on walking, though David knew it cost her energy. Every step was a challenge for her legs, but she pushed through it, her determination clear. David, on the other hand, was used to long walks in the desert. The dry heat didn't bother him as much. He had trained for survival in tough environments, and he had learned to ignore the discomfort. But he still kept a close watch on the sky. There was no telling what dangers could be out there, and they needed to be prepared. As the hours passed, the heat became unbearable. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of golden dunes. The sand burned underfoot, and the air shimmered with the heat. David had to remind himself that they had a destination. Something important awaited them, something that could change everything. But for now, the vast emptiness of the desert made it hard to remember that. "We should rest soon," David said, looking over at Vera, who was slowing down. She nodded, though she didn't say anything. She was focused on the path ahead, but David could see the exhaustion in her face. She was pushing herself far beyond what she should. David felt a sense of responsibility toward her, but he couldn't force her to rest. It was her decision to make. After a few more miles, they found shelter in the shadow of a rock formation, a small oasis of coolness in the midst of the blistering desert. David set up a small camp, and they both sat down, grateful for the break. Vera, exhausted but still determined, drank some water from the supply he'd brought. Her breathing was heavy, but she didn't complain. "I didn't expect it to be this hard," she said quietly after a while. Her voice was tired, but there was something in it, a kind of resolve. "I thought I would be stronger by now." David turned to her, offering a smile. "You're stronger than you think." Vera gave a small, uncertain smile in return. She seemed to appreciate his words, though she didn't speak again for a while. The heat of the day was unbearable, and the desert seemed to stretch on without end. But they couldn't afford to rest for long. They had to keep moving if they were going to reach the ruins before nightfall. David packed up their camp, and together they began the next leg of their journey. The day passed slowly, the sun hanging high above them, but Vera began to pick up her pace, no longer stumbling with each step. It was as if something inside her had clicked. Her purpose had become clearer, and she was determined to see it through. As the sun began to set, they reached the edge of a large canyon. The terrain was rougher here, the ground dotted with rocks and jagged cliffs. It was a different kind of danger, one that they would have to be careful around. The canyon stretched for miles, and it wasn't clear how they would cross it. But Vera seemed confident. She looked at the canyon and then back at David. "We're close," she said, her voice steady. "The ruins are just beyond the canyon. We'll have to find a way across." David nodded, his thoughts racing. The canyon was a challenge, but it wasn't impossible. He had survived worse. Together, they could make it. He looked at Vira, whose expression was serious and determined. She was ready, and that was all that mattered. The journey had been long, and they had faced many obstacles, but they were almost there. The ruins lay just beyond the canyon, waiting to reveal their secrets. "Let's rest here for the night," David said, looking at the canyon ahead. "We'll figure out how to get across in the morning." Vira nodded, and the two of them set up camp once more, knowing that tomorrow would bring the final stretch of their journey. The ruins were so close, but the desert had one final challenge to throw at them: the canyon. The night was quiet, but the stars above them seemed to promise that the next day would bring answers. The canyon loomed before them, its jagged cliffs stretching high into the sky. The landscape was stark and harsh, with the ground below filled with deep cracks and sharp rocks. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape. David knew they couldn't afford to wait much longer. "We have to find a way across," David said, his voice firm as he looked at Vera. She nodded, her eyes scanning the canyon. Her silver-blue eyes seemed to glow softly in the fading light. The determination in her face hadn't wavered since they set out on this journey. Despite the challenges, despite the pain she had endured, she remained focused on the goal ahead, the ruins that might hold the key to her past, to her survival. Vera stepped forward, carefully picking her way across the rocky ground, her gaze never leaving the canyon walls. David watched her, admiring her strength. He had no doubt she was the reason they had made it this far. Without her knowledge and determination, he would have been lost in the vast desert by now. "There's a narrow path up ahead," Vera said after a long silence. "It might lead us to the other side." David turned to look where she was pointing. The path she mentioned was a steep, rocky climb up one of the canyon walls. It wasn't an easy climb, but it was their best option. He turned back to Vera. "Are you sure you're up for it?" he asked, concern in his voice. Vera gave him a determined look, her shoulders squared. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady. "We need to get to the other side." David nodded. He had seen the same determination in her eyes many times before. There was no stopping her now. "Then let's do it." They began the climb. The rocks were sharp, and the incline was steep, but Vera moved with surprising agility, despite her earlier injuries. David kept close behind her, making sure she didn't struggle too much. Every few steps, he would reach out to steady her, offering a hand when needed. Vera accepted his help without hesitation, but she always made sure to keep going, not letting her weakness stop her. The climb was difficult, but it wasn't long before they reached a small plateau on the canyon wall. They paused there to catch their breath. From their vantage point, they could see the ruins in the distance, barely visible against the desert landscape. It was a faint outline, but it was there. They were so close now. Vira's eyes followed his gaze. "It's just beyond that ridge," she said, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "We're almost there." David felt a surge of hope. They had come so far, faced so many challenges, and now the end was in sight. The ruins, whatever secrets they held, were just ahead. They had to make it. They rested for a few more moments, gathering their strength. Then, without another word, they continued their climb, moving cautiously but quickly. The sun had set completely, and the sky was filled with stars. The cool desert night had arrived, but the air was still dry and heavy with dust. As they reached the top of the ridge, David's heart pounded with excitement. The ruins were clearer now, towering in the distance like ancient giants. The structures were massive, built from stone that had weathered centuries of harsh winds and sun. It was a sight that filled David with awe. Vira's voice broke the silence. "This is it," she said, a note of reverence in her voice. "This is where it all started." David looked at her, unsure of what she meant, but he could see the emotion in her eyes, the weight of the moment settling on her. She had led them here, and now, whatever came next was up to them. They descended the ridge carefully, making their way toward the ruins. The wind howled through the canyon as they neared the ancient structures, sending dust swirling around them. The air felt heavy with history, as if the ruins themselves were alive, waiting for something. As they approached the entrance of the ruins, Vera stopped and turned to David. "This is the place," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Everything that happened to me. It's all connected here." David nodded, his expression serious. "Then let's find out what's inside. Together." With that, they stepped into the ruins. The darkness enveloped them, but the faint glow of Vera's eyes provided enough light to guide the way. The air was cool inside, the stone walls smooth but worn by time. They moved forward cautiously, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stillness. David didn't know what they would find inside these ancient walls, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, they would face it together. The air inside the ruins was cool and still. The walls, made of ancient stone, loomed over them, their surface worn by centuries of wind and time. David and Vera moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, the faint glow of her eyes illuminating the path ahead. The silence felt heavy, almost as though the ruins were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Vera's steps were steady, but there was a sense of urgency in her movements. She didn't speak, but her eyes kept darting around, as if searching for something. She had led them this far, and now the moment had come to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden in the heart of these ancient walls. "Do you remember this place?" David asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper in the stillness. Vera didn't answer immediately. She was focused on something ahead, her eyes narrowing as she studied the wall. There were strange symbols carved into the stone, symbols that seemed familiar, yet foreign at the same time. "Yes," she said at last, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I remember it. I was here, long ago. This place. It's where everything changed." David stopped in his tracks, turning to look at her. "What do you mean? What happened here?" Vera hesitated, her gaze locked on the symbols. "I was part of something important. A mission, a purpose. But I was separated from my people. I was lost." She paused, her eyes clouded with memories. "This place holds the answers to my past, to who I really am." David didn't press her further. He could see how much this meant to her. Whatever had happened here, whatever she had lost, it was a part of her that she had been searching for all this time. And now, finally, it was within reach. They moved deeper into the ruins, following the winding passageways. As they rounded a corner, they came upon a large chamber. In the center of the room stood a strange pedestal, covered in dust and age. The walls around them were lined with more of the same symbols, but they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Vera approached the pedestal, her heart racing. She reached out a hand and carefully brushed the dust away from its surface. There, embedded in the stone, was a large crystal. It was unlike anything David had ever seen. Its surface was smooth and shining, as though it had been untouched by time. "This is it," Vera said softly, almost reverently. "The heart of the temple. It's the key to everything." David looked at the crystal, then back at her. "What is it? What does it do?" Vera didn't answer right away. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the crystal. "It's a power source, a connection to my people. They used it to guide their missions, to communicate over great distances. But something went wrong. The signal was lost. I was left behind." David stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "So, this crystal can help you find them. Can it help you get home?" Vera looked up at him, her expression a mix of hope and sadness. "I don't know. I hope so. But even if it doesn't, it's the only piece of my past that remains." She stood there for a moment, her gaze fixed on the crystal. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and placed her hand on it. The crystal began to glow brighter, its surface warming under her touch. A low hum filled the air, resonating with a strange energy. The walls seemed to tremble, and for a moment, David thought the whole structure might collapse. But then the hum grew louder, and a beam of light shot upward from the pedestal, piercing the darkness above. Vera stepped back, her eyes wide with shock. "What's happening?" David asked, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I don't know," Vera whispered. "It's awakening." The light from the crystal began to form shapes in the air, holographic images appearing before them. David saw strange symbols, maps, and alien landscapes, each one shifting and changing before his eyes. It was like a visual representation of a lost history, a history that had been buried for centuries. And then, at the center of the display, there was a face that looked strangely familiar. It was an alien face, much like Vera's, but older, wiser. It was a leader, someone important from her past. "This is my people," Vera said, her voice filled with emotion. "The one who led us, the one who gave me my purpose." David could see the tears in her eyes, but there was a sense of peace in her expression. She had found what she had been searching for. The answers, the memories, everything she had lost, were now before her. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the holographic display unfold before them. The light from the crystal was fading, but its power had already given them something priceless: knowledge and a path forward. David looked at Vera, his heart full of respect and admiration. "You've found it, haven't you? Your past, your people." Vera nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Yes. And now I can move forward. I can find my way home." David knew their journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more dangers to face. But for now, in this moment, they had found something greater than survival. They had found hope, and that was enough.